Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Good morning and welcome everyone to the webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started even though we have a few people still coming on board so that we can stay on time. My name is Emily Edmonds. I'm with the NC Growing Together project at the Center for Environmental Farming Systems. And we are on the 6th webinar in our series for food and farm business development in North Carolina. This is co-sponsored with the Rural Center, and we are very, very grateful for them being here with us to put these on. I'm really excited about today's presentation. I'm going to give you a little overview of what we're doing today and what we're going to go through, and then I'm going to introduce you to Leo John, who is the Business and Investor Outreach Legal Specialist with the Securities Division at the NC Secretary of State's office. And he's going to go through some of these new laws that will impact businesses in North Carolina. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of how to use the platform, how to ask questions, all of that sort of technical stuff, and then we'll talk with Leo, and we will have a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any specific questions or things that you don't understand, I'll show you how to ask those questions, and we'll address that at the end while we have Leo on the line. For those of you who have not come to one of these before or worked with us before, NC Growing Together is a 5-year USDA NEFA-funded project at CEFS. We're based at NC State, at A&T, and at the NC Department of Agriculture and Consumer Sciences. We focused on 4 primary areas, moving local and regional food into supply chains across the state and the region, and trying to develop models that will work for other states across the country. So we've done a lot with farmer capacity and supply chain expansion in our first few years, and now we're really moving into partnerships with both the small business center networks across the state and the local and regional governments across the state to try to create more supportive business environments for food and farm businesses that are developing. And so this is part of that bucket of work. If you have any questions about NC Growing Together, feel free to reach out to me after the webinar or to check out our website, ncgrowingtogether.org. So for the platform today, just so that you guys know what you're looking at, over on your right-hand side of your screen, you have your sort of control panel for the webinar. If you look at the handouts section, which has a little triangle next to it, if you click that, you'll see a PDF version of today's slides. You are more than welcome to download those and use them to check out links or keep on file with you later. And then you are also, if you go down a little bit farther, you'll see questions. That's where you can type in any questions that you have during the presentation, and I will see those and direct them to Leo either at the time if it works or at the end if it doesn't. You are all muted by default, so you will not be able to use your voices, so you'll have to use the questions box to get in touch with the staff who are running the webinar. At the end of this, this is being recorded, So we will have a link to a YouTube video that you can watch again later if you have questions. And you will get an email from me with that link and the PDF version of the slides at either later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. And if you have any other topics you'd like to see in this series, please feel free to reach out and let us know. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to Leo. Please feel free to let me know if you have questions or difficulties during the webinar. And we are really excited to have Leo with us today. Leo, thank you for being on.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Emily, for inviting me to do this webinar. I'm going to attempt to show you what I look like. Let's see if this happens. There you go. So that's me. Just so if you see me on the streets or feel like saying hello, if you ever catch sight of me, feel free to do so. My name is Leo John. I work with the North Carolina Secretary of State's office in the Securities division, and I'm often traveling to small business centers and really all over the state providing this kind of educational information. So my contact information is on the first slide, so feel free to reach out to me if you have specific questions after this webinar and we don't answer them here. All right, going back offline visual mode. Okay. So now that you're not going to be distracted by my beautiful face, let's get into the meat of what we're going to talk about. So I'm particularly excited to be doing this webinar because for two reasons. One, as I understand it, this group is really people from all over the state, especially from sort of rural counties and rural cities, etc., or rural towns. And the message is of particular relevance to sort of the smaller towns in the state because of the change in the way the laws were written in the past few years. It is now possible for average investors to now invest in small startup businesses. And this is, for a lot of you that might seem like, like what's the big deal? Well, in the past, it used to be that investing in these kind of startups, these kind of high growth, but also high risk businesses, was limited to sort of high net worth individuals. These individuals or venture capital funds or investment funds are often located in kind of the bigger cities, even within the state as well as across the country. They're often in kind of the, the Bostons and the Silicon Valleys and places where sort of, the small entrepreneur starting something in his garage is often not able to access funds from. So because of these changes in the federal and state laws, it's not going to be possible for kind of average entrepreneurs to raise money from people in their communities, and I think that's a big shift. The other reason this group is of particular interest to me is I track this kind of crowdfunding fairly closely, and from everything that I'm seeing, a lot of the crowdfunding activity, the investment crowdfunding activity, is happening among the exact businesses that are part of this group, which is the food, the farm, the restaurants, the cupcake shops, the breweries, the distilleries, all of those kind of food and groceries and, all of those businesses that are really the kind of folks that are going to be on this call. So for those two reasons, I think this seminar is of particular interest to me. Okay, let's see if I can move ahead over here. Okay, there you go. So a quick disclaimer. Some of this may sound like legal information, and it is, but it's not legal advice. If you are going to be helping a small business, or if you are a small business yourself, we strongly recommend you talk to an attorney who is familiar with this kind of this area, especially around securities and business law, and take sort of their counsel before you actually go and do a securities offering. Secretary of State is Elaine Marshall, has been since the mid-90s. For all of you who are from North Carolina or are involved in kind of North Carolina business, you probably know her. This is a quick outline of what I am going to cover, and hopefully this will give you a good feel for what some of the issues are in terms of what we're going to be talking about. So I'll start with kind of the basic. What is crowdfunding? Talk about an example. I'll mention the basic general rule in this area and talk about some of the common exemptions. We will go in depth into the North Carolina PACES Act. So for those of you who like to Google things after webinars, I would recommend you Google this phrase, NC PACES Act. This is the name of the legislation that was passed by the North Carolina General Assembly last year that made possible the state-based crowdfunding law that we're going to be talking about. So NC PACES Act would be the phrase to look up. Also relevant to this discussion is the federal crowdfunding law, which also went into effect last year. And to find out more about that particular piece of legislation, I would look up the phrase regulation crowdfunding and the SEC, or regulation crowdfunding and Title III, or regulation crowdfunding and the Jobs Act. Those are all phrases that you could use to search. In terms of this presentation, we'll end with some sort of common sense things that all of us as investors and some of us as entrepreneurs need to keep in mind when we are getting into the space of federal and state crowdfunding. Okay, so let's start with kind of the basic. What is crowdfunding, right? And for all of you that are familiar with Kickstarter and Indiegogo and GoFundMe, it is just that, right? It is an online money-raising strategy. It essentially began with kind of lots of people going online and donating small amounts of money to fund a particular project, an idea, a book, a movie, something that they wanted to see happen, right? It usually is done online. It doesn't have to be done online, but because of the growth of the internet, it's become possible to organize these kind of fundraisers, and so it's usually done online. So what happened was in kind of the mid-2000s, the 2006-2007 timeframe, websites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo started sort of taking off. And it began as a way to get lots of people to donate money towards a cause, and in return get something nominal, right? In return get a copy of the book, get a you get to come spend a day with the director of the movie, or something nominal like that. And then businesses started seeing the possibilities there, and they said, what if we could use this method to sort of crowdfund our product development? So businesses started, developing little cool devices and products, and asking people to essentially pre-purchase those products, right? So one of the biggest Kickstarter campaigns that has ever happened is a campaign by a company called Pebble, P-E-B-B-L-E. They were a smartwatch company before Apple got into the smartwatch business. They raised $10 million in their first round of Kickstarter money, and in return for average contributions of $100, they gave all their contributors a watch. So they told them, hey, once the watch is ready, we'll send you a watch. So in effect, these people were pre-purchasing this particular watch. In fact, Pebble was so successful, they came back a second time, and then they raised $20 million using the Kickstarter method. So it became this way for businesses to essentially fund product development. All kinds of coolers and sauces and things got developed this way. So Congress was also apparently watching this kind of development, and they said, perhaps there is a way for us to use crowdfunding to fill or to solve another problem. And the problem, as they saw it, was access to capital for small businesses. So Congress thought, what if we use this exact same model of connecting people who want to give little bits of money and businesses that need a pool of cash, and what if we added to that a profit motive? So in effect, what they did was they said, hey, instead of people just donating money or giving $100 and getting a watch in return, what if they were allowed to invest in businesses in return for getting a piece of the business? They would give the $100 or $200 and get 10 shares of the company, or they would buy a promissory note in the company, offering the company a loan in return for 5%, 6% rate of interest. So they, in fact, made it an investment-based crowdfunding model. This was legislation passed by the Jobs Act of 2012, and it made possible several different types of investment crowdfunding. And this is a distinction that I'll come back to in a few slides down the line, because it's an important distinction, difference between donation-based versus investment-based crowdfunding. So here is a classic example of what we are talking about, right? And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this kind of scenario. So all of you have probably met with or are yourself an entrepreneur, somebody who's trying to get a business off the ground. So I have a little example here where I say there is a lady by the name of Amy. Okay, Amy is a resident of Namio County in North Carolina. Amy is a natural-born baker, right? That's what she does. She's really good at baking cupcakes. She shares her cupcakes with her friends and family. They love it. They tell her, you should start a little business because you're clearly good at it. So maybe she goes over to a little town nearby and she opens a little store. The store is popular, right? There are people who wait for, in long lines trying to get into her cupcake store. Amy has a problem, right? She's got all these customers who want her cupcakes, and she's not able to satisfy their demand. She needs capital, right? That she's got to expand her business. She's got to open a new location. Amy has a number of choices when it comes to obtaining capital, right? She could go the traditional route, go to the banks, the SBA, credit unions. Those are all perfectly good options. She could go to venture capital firms. They are sort of the more professional investing class. She could go to wealthy individuals who fund businesses with their own capital, like the individuals on the TV show Shark Tank. Those people write big checks, $10,000, $20,000, $100,000 checks, and Amy could get some funding that way. Or she could go the most commonly used route, which is she could raise money from friends and family. These are people who typically fund the first round of capital. let's say Amy chooses to go with friends and family, right? So now Amy is essentially giving up a piece of her business in return for cash from friends and family. She is in fact doing a securities offering. She's selling equity in her business, or she is borrowing money by issuing a promissory note. All of those are examples of securities offerings, and Amy now has to be careful because there are all kinds of federal and state securities laws that she has to comply with. And I won't sort of go into a whole bunch of details about all of those laws other than to say, well, the basic general rule in this area is that Amy, or really any one of us, cannot offer or sell any security unless, number one, you register that offering, number two, you find an exemption for that offering, or number three, you have that offering classified as a security covered under federal law, which is essentially a special class of securities. And I tell you all that just to point out that there are existing ways for small businesses to issue securities and raise capital other than the crowdfunding method, which is what we're going to get into more detail. But as you can see in this slide, there are all kinds of exemptions, mostly for small offerings. So for the classic small business that just needs, some capital, they could raise money under 17(9), which is an exemption which allows an offer to not more than 25 persons. And there are the exemptions that Amy could use. The problem was it was not possible for an Amy to reach out to a large number of people. We're talking, 100 people, 200, 300, 400 people, without running into problems of sort of publicizing securities offerings in a way that violates securities laws. So one of the big developments with crowdfunding is, and here's another exemption, the 506 exemption, which sort of allows businesses to raise capital by essentially sidestepping state laws and merely complying with a federal law. But really, the possibility of Amy reaching out to lots of people was essentially non-existent because of the way the securities laws were written. With the changes that the federal law made and with the changes that the state made in July of 2016, now it's going to be possible for Amy to reach out to several hundred people. She can do it online. She does not anymore have to sort of reach out to the 5 or 10 wealthy individuals in her town who she may or may not know. She can now use essentially the power of the internet to reach a wide audience of people and perhaps persuade them to invest in her cupcake shop. And that is I guess the promise of crowdfunding, that Amy can now reach lots of people in the state and have them sort of bankroll her business in a way that she could not do in the past, which is in many ways exciting, and from our point of view, in many ways unnerving, because we are also kind of the regulator in this space, and we now have the possibility of lots of investors being involved in these high-risk startup stage businesses, many of which are likely to fail. As all of you probably know, a lot of small businesses tend to fail in their early days. I mentioned I'd come back to the difference between donation-based and investment-based crowdfunding, and here is what I was talking about. The donation-based model involves websites like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, GoFundMe, and they don't involve the issuance of securities, right? The people that are contributing money in those cases are getting something tangible in return. They're getting a cooler, they're getting a watch, they're getting a t-shirt, a mug, a book, something nominal. The people who are investing in investment-based crowdfunding on websites such as AngelList, WeFunder, Start Engine, etc. These people are actually investing their money with the hope of some kind of a return in the future. They are doing it for a profit motive in many cases. They're doing it because they want to make a financial gain, right? They're not just expecting a t-shirt or a mug. They are essentially investing in the business to make a financial return. And if that is going on, then you now have a securities offering, and you have to make sure you comply with state and federal securities laws in this space. So rather than talk in abstract terms, I thought I'd just show you a few websites just to show you kind of what I'm referring to. So I'm going to try and attempt to go to these websites, which I have opened, and we'll see if you can see what I'm talking about. So here is Kickstarter. Kickstarter, probably many of you are familiar with, involves kind of the movie project. In this case, this particular movie is raising, whatever amount of dollars. They've got pledges of $54,000. They've got 586 backers, and they're being promised some perks in return. There are no securities being offered in this case. Now I want to show you the website wefunder.com, which is a website where investment crowdfunding is now occurring. And if you sort of scroll down to one of these companies that are raising money, figured I'd show you something you could relate to, which would maybe be the Texas Beer Company project or issuer. If you look at what they're offering, they're essentially offering a Class B unit of the company, and they've priced it at $140, which means if you invest $140 in this business, you are getting one unit, which I think means a LLC member unit. It could be equity in the company. It could be debt in the company. It could be other types of securities in the company. But it looks a lot like Kickstarter in that they have set out a minimum, which is $100,000 as their goal. They've set out their maximum, which is $1 million, and they've already got 114 investors to put in $122,000. Right. So this is an example of an existing investment crowdfunding offering that's going on. Nextseed.com is another website which I think has a lot of food-based offerings, and it also does a lot of intrastate crowdfunding, which is a type of North Carolina-based crowdfunding that I was hoping to show you. So I would take a look at these websites to get a sense as to the kind of offerings that are going on. So let me just click on this. This is a restaurant. It's based in LA, and let's see, they are offering, it looks like some kind of a revenue share agreement. They are raising a minimum of $150,000, and they've got 74 investors who put in $50,000. So what they're promising their investors is, we'll give you a 1.5x multiple on your investment. And I haven't looked through all this, but I imagine it's some kind of revenue share where, from all the money that we get from selling food at our restaurant, we're going to set aside, say, 10% until we pay off all the investors their principal, and then we'll give you 50% on top of that as a financial return for making your investment. So all these websites are registered either with the SEC or with the SEC being the Securities and Exchange Commission, or with their state securities regulator. In many cases, they have been operating sort of in the past couple of years under specific exemptions that they can operate under. So when you get a chance, take a look at the difference between these two sets of websites. It'll give you a sense as to kind of why that distinction matters. Okay, so now moving on to the North Carolina crowdfunding option. So I told you that you have to, if you're doing a securities offering, you have to register the offering or you have to find an exemption for it. The North Carolina crowdfunding option is an exemption from registration of your securities offering. So it allows businesses to raise capital without registering the offering, which is a fair amount of savings for the small business in terms of the costs of putting together their offering documents. So what does the North Carolina crowdfunding exemption look like? I have a slide here which kind of gives you an overview. The state legislature called it the Invest North Carolina exemption. The idea being to allow North Carolina investors to invest in North Carolina businesses. And that is a significant point. Part of this crowdfunding is part of the way the laws are written in this space. The only way this exemption works is if everybody operating in this exemption is a resident of North Carolina. So you have to have North Carolina investors putting money into North Carolina businesses. If you have even one investor who's outside the state, the exemption may be lost, in which case you may be in a little bit of a pickle because now you may be doing an unregistered offering without an exemption, which could set you back a little bit in terms of your business goals. So keep that in mind. An important piece of this legislation is that all of the activity has to be within the state. So what is the framework for this kind of a securities offering? Well, one of the main rules is you can only raise a maximum of $2 million under this exemption. So that is the cap for any business that's trying to raise funds under North Carolina crowdfunding. You are limited to $2 million. If you do not have or do not want to provide reviewed or audited financials, meaning a balance sheet, an income statement, some kind of a financial statement, if you do not have or do not want to provide that, you are limited to $1 million in terms of how much funds you can raise under the exemption. As I mentioned, all investors must be North Carolina residents. There is a limit on how much an individual can invest in one of these offerings. And that limit is $5,000 per business or per offering, which means I, as an investor, can put $5,000 into Joe's food truck. I can put $5,000 into Katie's small tax business, and I can put $5,000 into Amy's cupcake shop. However, I cannot put more than $5,000 into any one of these individual offerings. Now, that is a significant difference from the federal crowdfunding option, which is another option for small business, which allows you to raise money across 50 states. The federal option limits you based on how much each investor makes in terms of their income. And we'll get into that in a couple of slides down the line. Before a business can do any kind of advertising or try and raise money, they're required to file certain paperwork, certain forms, disclosure document, that kind of thing with the North Carolina Securities Division. Once the business has begun fundraising, they now have an obligation to keep their investors informed as to how the fundraising is going. And once the fundraising is closed, as long as they still have investors under that crowdfunding offering, then they have to continue to give them quarterly updates as to how the business is doing. This is a significant investor protection mechanism that's been built in that requires the business to keep investors informed as to what they're doing with the funds they've raised and when or if the investor can expect some kind of a financial return for the money they've invested. Another important point, the company, Amy's Cupcake Shop, can raise money using her own website, or she can raise money using a third-party funding portal. In either case, that website has to be registered with the North Carolina Securities Division. However, a point to be made there is Amy being able to use her own website is a significant advantage to Amy because a third-party funding portal would charge a particular rate, which is typically 5, 6, 7% of the amount that's being raised, as a fee for hosting this kind of a securities offering. Using a third-party registered funding portal is a requirement under the federal law. However, under the state, the North Carolina PACES offering, Amy can use her own website to conduct the securities offering. So that is a significant advantage to Amy compared to the federal model. So there are essentially two channels for crowdfunding, if you want to think of it as two paths or two roads to raising money under the North Carolina PACES Act exemption. One is called the NCPO and the other is called the LPO. The NCPO is for businesses that want to raise a maximum of $2 million. They have to use the internet to conduct the fundraiser. They can, of course, use their own website, or they can use a registered funding portal. In many parts of the state, we are told broadband is not as high speed as we would like. In many cases, businesses may not want to use the internet. In those cases, we have added the option of the LPO, the local public offering. However, any local public offering is limited to a fundraiser of a maximum of $250,000. You don't have to use the internet. You may use the internet. And you are limited in terms of the type of instruments you can offer. You're limited to equity, debt, or the so-called revenue share agreements. So if you're interested in the space, get familiar with these two concepts, the NCPO and the LPO, and who it works for. One is for those who want to use the internet, and the other is for those that want or may not want to use the internet. Okay, if you're looking for an overview slide for what all is involved in a North Carolina crowdfunding offering, this slide might be it for you. This is kind of the checklist of all the things you've got to be thinking about if you're thinking of raising money from the crowd by issuing some kind of an investment offering. Number one, your financials. So how much in terms of financial information do you have? What kind of information are you comfortable giving out to the crowd? Number two, all of the funds until you've hit your minimum target offering amount, all of the funds has to be kept in an escrow account, which means the business does not have access to the funds until they've hit their minimum, which also means that as a business, you have to start thinking about finding an escrow agent or an escrow account. Number three, are you going to use a funding portal to do your crowdfunding offering, or are you going to use your own website? If you are using a funding portal, what are the fees associated with it? Are you comfortable with those fees? If you're using your own website, are you going to create a new web page to do the offering? How are you going to sort of manage the process of doing the offering? Okay, I'm not sure what happened there, but let me go back. So that would be the question of whether to use a funding portal or a website. The fourth thing to think about is, are you going to prepare, or you have to prepare a disclosure document? How are you going to prepare that? Are you going to use an attorney? Are you going to do it yourself? What kind of risks does your business have, and what kind of risks could you disclose to your investors so that you are protected in the future in case things don't go as planned? One of the big fears for people that are issuing securities is you are required to provide all material information that an investor needs to know at the time of making the investment. This disclosure document is where you would provide all those risks, and you'd lay out all the sort of possibilities. So it's really, a disclosure document is your friend, and you've got to pay a lot of attention to what your disclosure document is going to include. The other thing you've got to think about is, and probably a very significant part of all this is, how are you going to advertise and market your offering to residents of the state, right? Remember, we've got a fairly large state. We got 10 million people, far-flung areas. Most of them would never travel to Amy's cupcake shop to taste her cupcakes. So in that situation, how are you going to persuade all these people who are never going to try your products to make an investment in your business? What is permitted, what is not permitted? And there are certain rules about how you can use Facebook and social media, Twitter, etc., and what you can say and what you cannot say in these kind of offerings. So you've got to get familiar with those rules too. There are, of course, forms to be filled out, and those forms have to be submitted to the North Carolina Securities Division before you actually begin a securities offering. I have included a link here to our website where you can find a lot more information. There are FAQs, there are rules, the statute is up there, and I would encourage you to take a look at that website for additional information. So just running through some of the topics I laid out in kind of 30,000 foot level. Well, financials, they have to be prepared in accordance with GAAP. They could include things like balance sheets, statements of income, has to include kind of your notes, your footnotes, statement of changes to stockholders' equity. Remember, if you're raising above $1 million only, do you have to worry about kind of providing reviewed or audited financials, which is different from the federal crowdfunding option, which requires financial information for anybody doing more than $100,000. Your escrow agent, and this is an important point. Your escrow agent could be a bank, it could be a depository institution, or it could be your lawyer. This is a significant change from how the federal law works in this area, because it does not permit kind of the use of a lawyer in trying to tailor this exemption to the use of North Carolina investors and businesses. We were told that many businesses have existing relationships with law firms, and the law firms typically have kind of an escrow account or a fiduciary account where they typically house funds for things like home closings or any kind of transactions that require the lawyer to hold the funds. So we've added this option where a lawyer or a law firm could act as your escrow agent to handle the funds for you. Remember, the business cannot actually access the money until you've hit the minimum. Until that time, it has to stay with the escrow agent or the escrow account. The minimums are set by based on NCPO or LPO. It's 20% for NCPO and 25% for LPO. The funding portal or website, there are you could use a registered funding portal. Right now, we don't have a funding portal that is actually registered to operate a funding portal in the state. You could also, of course, use your own website to conduct the offering. You are required to add what's called a message board or a communication channel to your website if you're using your own website for the crowdfunding offering. It looks a lot like, if you go to any of the websites I told you, it looks a lot like a message board where investors ask questions and the business responds to those questions. Your disclosure document I mentioned to you is crucial. Make sure you highlight all the risks of the business, and this would be a good place to get an attorney involved to sort of get a feel for the risks associated with your business. Your advertising and marketing rules depend on kind of what type of offering are you doing. If you're doing an LPO up to $250,000, you have a little more flexibility in terms of what you can say. You can use billboards, you can use face-to-face meetings, you can sort of go to your church and talk about your offering. All those are permitted as long as you submit all your advertising in advance of any use to the Securities division so we can take a look at it, make sure it does not sort of raise any eyebrows, does not mislead, and then you can go ahead and use your advertising. So those rules are far more flexible and open compared to an NCPO, which is of course the $2 million offering that limits you to tombstone ads, which are essentially really short sort of bursts of information. You know, this is how much we're fundraising, this is the name of the company, this is where you go to find out more information. So you're very limited in terms of what kind of information you can provide under the NCPO option. There are forms associated with this. They're available on our website at this particular link. I have a slide here that just talks about how crowdfunding is going. So about 35 states have now approved some version of a state crowdfunding, and as of last year, almost 180 offerings had begun. So this kind of securities offerings are now happening all over the country. Regulation crowdfunding is the federal option, and I won't spend too much time on it. I have a bunch of sites as to how it fits within federal law. I have a couple of slides here that talk about the rules for federal crowdfunding. As you can see, there are additional financial information that you have to provide if you're raising money under this particular option. How much an individual can invest really depends on their income in the federal option, and it depends on whether you make less or more than $100,000. Title III federal crowdfunding has also been in effect for about a year now. As of yesterday, there were, and this particular slide is for 2016, and I happened to check the information for as of yesterday, and it looks like now there are more than 450 offerings that are live or that have been ongoing. Businesses ranging from breweries to food trucks to restaurants are all raising funds under this particular federal option. North Carolina has had, I think the last I checked, 5 federal crowdfunding offerings. One from Davidson, one from Greensboro, and 3, I think, from kind of the Raleigh-Durham area. I have not seen a food-based offering yet. A lot of them have been kind of technology companies. But the federal crowdfunding option is in effect and has been active for about a year now. Okay, so let's see. Trying to move ahead here. The next few slides are really just common sense tips on what you should be thinking about if you're thinking about a crowdfunding offering, whether it's federal or state, and it's self-explanatory, so I'm not really going to spend too much time on it. I will point out that crowdfunding offerings are high risk, and I'm sure this doesn't come as news to most of you, but obviously small businesses at an early stage tend to have a much higher risk of failure. I'm actually trying to plug in my my power cord, so that's why you can hear me moving around. But obviously these kind of businesses are much more high risk, and the Small Business Administration tells us that 50% of these companies fail in the first 5 years. So obviously whether you're doing an offering or investing in these kind of offerings, you have to be aware that your risks are much higher. The possibility of losing all your funds is also much higher in these kind of offerings. Okay, so some of the tips are fairly self-explanatory. Don't discount disclosure, right? You are doing a securities offering under an exemption from registration. You're still required to provide all material information that a business should provide at the time of raising funds. So don't discount that, because that still applies to you even if you're doing a crowdfunding offering. Avoid distractions. This is a good thing to think about, because a lot of people think of crowdfunding as a great way to get on board a lot of people, and that's certainly true. You now have folks who are invested in your business, but that also makes them kind of co-owners of the business, which of course means they now have an interest in how the business is doing, what's going on. Has Amy opened her new store? How are the cupcakes selling? All of those things are going to be things that these investors are going to want to know. They're going to call the businesses and they're going to ask questions, and that's going to distract the business owner from running, or the everyday business of running the business. So that is something that you have to be comfortable with. The idea of having all these people on board and as potential shareholders of the business. The other thing to think about with having a whole bunch of owners is, if this is going to be the only fundraiser you're doing, you don't have to worry as much. But if you are going to, in the future, go out and raise funds from maybe in a second round of funding from a private equity fund or a venture capital fund, you're now going to be looking at professional investors who are going to look at your shareholder cap table or the number of owners in the business, and they're going to be a little less excited about you if there are 100 shareholders or 200 shareholders, because now they have to deal with a whole bunch of people who might have a say in the future of the company. And they'd much rather deal with kind of the 2, 3, or 4 person or the 4 shareholder company, where it's much easier to get things done. So, so be aware that you may be a little less attractive to some of these professional investors. Consider alternatives. This is again a good common sense thing to think about, because crowdfunding may be kind of the newest option, but it's certainly not going to be, in all cases, the best option. There are other exemptions, there are other sources of funds, and you should consider all of those before you dive into crowdfunding. This particular tip, the no secondary market for these kind of shares, is particularly relevant to all of us as investors, because we're all used to being able to easily sell shares of companies that we own. we own shares in Walmart, we want to sell shares, we can call our broker, or we can, go online and hit sell, and we can get out of those shares. If you own shares in Amy's Cupcake Shop, though, there might not be a secondary market for these kind of shares, in which case you may be stuck waiting for an exit on Amy's Cupcake Shop. And you have to be comfortable with the idea that the exit might not happen in 6 months, it might not happen in a year, it might take 5 years, or it might never happen at all. So there isn't as much of a secondary market for these kind of shares. Okay, so this is kind of the wrap-up slide for the myths. Crowdfunding is not easy money. These are not risk-free investments. You cannot simply crank up a website and crowdfund. This is an important point because I cannot tell you how many places I've been to where somebody comes up to me and tells me, I would love to start a website to do crowdfunding. And that's great, and we certainly hope more websites sort of pop up to do this kind of thing. But this would not be similar to Kickstarter because you would have to register this website, and you would have to follow some of the rules associated with these kind of websites that do crowdfunding as a funding portal. Not to say that these are cumbersome or they're impossible to overcome, but there's certainly some rules that you've got to follow, and so you've got to make sure you're familiar with those if you're going to crank up a website. And finally, these investments are not pre-screened, right? If you're doing a securities offering, you're filing certain paperwork with us, but we're not screening these to make sure whether these are good or bad investments for investors. As investors, we're all going to be required to do our own due diligence before we sort of fork out money and invest in these kind of businesses. Why do we tell you all this? Well, there are fairly stiff penalties associated with violations of securities laws. Making an unregistered offering of an unregistered agent may be a felony, depending on the intent involved. And your business could be exposed to penalties provided by securities laws, which include fines, jail time, and of course, you've got to worry about lawsuits from your investors who may come back to sort of try and retrieve any funds they've lost in a bad offering. Securities laws are primarily for the protection of investors. You're required to provide complete and accurate information before investors can make informed decisions. Some of the things you should be disclosing are listed here, and then I provide you a link to the website of NASA, which is essentially the Association of State Securities Regulators, and they have some good information as to what kind of material information you should be providing in your disclosure document. Yes, what I'm suggesting is you talk to a good securities attorney before you get into the space. I have some links here for those people who are sort of more self-help kind of people. Take a look at these links. They provide some more information. And of course, we are a resource. We want to be a resource in this area. And there's a phone number. Feel free to reach out to us. Emily, I will now hand it over to you. Emily, are you there?
Hey, Leo. Sorry, I was talking and no one can hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Sorry about that, everyone. Leo, thank you so much. That was a lot of material, and I think it probably raised a lot of questions that people will want to contact you about later. I don't have any questions that have come through in the questions box at this point. I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to shoot those in. In the meantime, if you do have questions about what Leo's presented here, you will receive an email with a PDF of these slides. You can check out the links. You'll have his contact information, and you can feel free to reach out to him afterwards. And also note that we have 2 more webinars in this series that will wrap up the year. The next one on September 7th is about changing trends in food businesses and how to support restaurants and other food businesses as they are shifting towards more local product. And then on October 10th, we are going to have Leo back again, and he is going to give us sort of an overview of trademarking and why it's really important for food and farm businesses to pay attention when they are doing their branding work and developing trademarks. So I don't have any additional questions. Leo, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
The only thing I would add is we at the North Carolina Secretary of State's office have an active outreach program. So we do travel all over the state. So if you feel like you have a business audience or an audience that would be interested in learning more about this kind of, this new option for fundraising, again, feel free to reach out to me because we do travel all over the state and we do make in-person presentations on this and other topics that are, helpful to small businesses.
Excellent. Thank you, Leo. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for getting those into me. Oh, I do have one question. Leo, can NC resident investors be do they have to be full-time residents, or could they be second home owners who have property in North Carolina? What's the sort of definition there?
So the statute only just says North Carolina residents.
Okay.
So right now, it would you could fall back on kind of the IRS definition of where you're a resident, right, when you pay your taxes. So, that could be an option. However, the statute is silent on kind of who is a North Carolina resident. So the only requirement in terms of the rules is you have to provide a local address, so a North Carolina address for where you're a resident. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but you are required to provide an address for where you're a resident of.
Okay, I think that is perfect. Thank you. All right, good job, Anne. We squeezed that one in for you. All right, thank you, everyone. We are going to end the recording now, and I will make sure that you get the PDF and the YouTube link sometime today or tomorrow. Again, Leo, thanks for joining us, and thanks to the Rural Center for helping us host these. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.